Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. The flower-arranging fiasco. Agatha Raisin glared at the hydrangeas. They were stubborn, unwieldy, and distinctly lacking in the quiet dignity that she felt was her trademark. Well, her aspirational trademark at least. In reality, Agatha Raisin, former London public relations maven, current village resident, was a whirlwind of expensive perfume, sharp elbows, and a terrifyingly focused determination to fit into the quaint, slow-paced life of the Cotswolds. Today, that determination was focused on winning the annual Castle Flower Show's Best in Class for a sympathetic display of local flora. She'd thought the title sounded elegant and suitably villagey. Her attempt so far, however, looked less like a sympathetic display and more like a floral massacre. She'd spent an hour wrestling with a clump of damp moss that refused to adhere to the base of her oasis. Beside her, on her immaculate, expensive oak table, sat a framed photograph of her arch rival, Blocksby, the vicar's wife, a woman whose flower arrangements looked like they had naturally, effortlessly emerged from the earth, radiating rustic charm and understated class. Mrs. Blocksby's arrangements were, as the vicar was fond of saying, a balm to the soul. Agatha's currently resembled a crime scene. She stabbed another piece of florist's wire into the soggy oasis. Damn it, she muttered, watching a promising cluster of delphiniums tilt drunkenly to the side. Why did she care? This was precisely the kind of small-minded provincial competition she would have ridiculed her London clients for worrying about. Yet here she was, sweat prickling her upper lip, her heart pounding at the thought of Mrs. Blocksby's gentle, patronizing smile when the judging began. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with green slime. This was undoubtedly a social embarrassment in the making. She picked up the phone to call Mrs. Blocksby, intending to concede defeat under the guise of an unavoidable emergency, when the front door knocker hammered with startling intensity. Agatha jumped, sending a jar of wire pins clattering to the floor. For heaven's sake, she growled, marching to the door. She yanked it open, ready to unleash a withering retort on whoever was interrupting her floral breakdown. It wasn't Mrs. Blocksby. It was Charles Fraser, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. Charles, a young baronet always impeccably tailored, was currently dishevelled. His golden hair, usually combed into a jaunty, carefree sweep, was stuck to his forehead. His elegant tweed jacket was buttoned wrongly, and he was pale, deeply, shockingly pale. "Agatha," he gasped, clutching the door frame. "Agatha, you have to help." Agatha took in his state. This wasn't the usual village pleasantry she was prepared for. Her irritation flickered and died, replaced by an immediate, almost instinctive surge of professionalism. In London, this meant a crisis, and Agatha Raisin was the queen of crisis management. "Charles, what is it?" "Come in," she commanded, pulling him into the hallway. He stumbled inside, nearly stepping into the pile of fallen florist's pins. He seemed not to notice the floral disaster in the adjacent room. "She's gone, Agatha. She's vanished." Agatha's eyebrows raised. "She? Who?" "Mrs. Blocksby." A brief, malicious flicker of hope crossed her mind. "No, not Mrs. Blocksby. Isabella," he cried, his voice breaking. "Isabella, she's gone." The name hung in the air, a social bombshell that temporarily silenced the imaginary applause Agatha had been preparing for. Isabella Vane, the village's resident enchantress, a young woman of spectacular beauty, immense wealth, and a certain maddeningly unknowable quality. She had breezed into Castle a year ago, buying the old manor, and immediately became the centre of all local attention and resentment. And today was her wedding day. The entire village was in a frenzy of excitement, expectation, and gossip about her impending nuptials to Charles Fraser himself. "Gone," Agatha repeated, the word tasting strange. "Gone where?" "The church is a 2-minute walk." Inwardly her mind raced. A runaway bride, a kidnapping, a purely PR disaster. The social implications were already exploding in her head. "She's not at the vicarage," Charles stammered, pulling at his collar. "She was staying there, you know." To be closer to the church, Mrs. Blocksby went to help her get ready, and the room was empty. Her dress is still hanging on the door. Her phone is on the nightstand. She's just gone. Agatha's mind clicked into high gear. The initial annoyance at her ruined flower arranging was completely forgotten. This was something real, something juicy, and something she could potentially fix, or at least be the first to know all the details about. "Where have you looked?" she asked, already visualizing a map of the village. "Everywhere. The manor, the church, the gardens. The vicar is beside himself. Mrs. Blocksby is trying to calm everyone down. But it's chaos." Charles looked on the verge of a full-scale panic attack. Agatha took a deep breath. This was her moment. This was the sort of social upheaval she was born to manage. She could step in, be the calm, effective London professional in the face of village, hysterical incompetence. She could solve this. She could even make Mrs. Blocksby look flustered, which was a deeply appealing bonus. "Right," she said, her voice dropping an octave, assuming its commanding PR register. "Let's not panic, Charles. Panicking is precisely what Isabella would not want us to do." A complete lie, Agatha thought. Isabella probably would love the drama. "We need a plan. When was the last time she was seen?" "This morning about 8, Charles said, rubbing his eyes. Mrs. Blocksby spoke to her then, checking if she needed anything. Isabella seemed happy, excited. He paused, though maybe a little quiet. Subtle clue, a small behavioral inconsistency, Agatha noted. Happy but quiet. That could mean anything from normal pre-wedding jitters to plotting an escape. Okay, and how did she get out? No one saw her leave the vicarage. No one. It's impossible. The vicarage is like a fortress on a Sunday. Agatha's eyes narrowed. In a village like Carsley, impossible usually just meant that someone was lying, or that everyone was too busy gossiping to notice anything. "Well," Agatha said, straightening her stained blouse and making a mental note to throw it away immediately, "we're not going to find her by standing around here. I need to see the scene. Let's go to the vicarage." She was already moving towards the door, ignoring the hydrangeas and the look of utter confusion on Charles's face, as he followed her out into the bright, deceptively peaceful Cotswold sunshine, which now seemed to be hiding a very inconvenient secret. Her flower arranging triumph would have to wait. There was a far more serious piece of social theatre to attend to, and Agatha Raisin was taking centre stage. Chapter 2. The vicarage carnival. Agatha marched Charles down the lane with the brisk, unsentimental stride of a woman who had a crisis to manage and an audience to manage it for. The walk to the vicarage was usually a tranquil affair, bordered by manicured hedges and the smug facades of Cotswold stone cottages. Today, however, it felt like running a gauntlet of twitching net curtains. By the time they reached the legate of the Church of St. Jude, the whispers were practically audible. The village was already gathering. Groups of women in pastel hats and men in stiff suits stood in clumps, ostensibly waiting for the service, but their eyes were firmly fixed on the vicarage next door. Agatha caught sight of Miss Pendleton, a retired schoolteacher whose nose was permanently wrinkled as if detecting a bad smell. Miss Pendleton was currently holding court near a stone gargoyle, whispering furiously to the butcher's wife, who looked scandalized but greedy for more. "Look at them," Agatha muttered to Charles, who was lagging behind, looking increasingly faint. "Vultures, the lot of them." She, of course, entirely excluded herself from this categorization. She was here in a professional capacity, not as a rubbernecker. They pushed through the vicarage gate. The usually serene front hall was a symphony of quiet hysteria. The Reverend Alf Blocksby was pacing the worn Persian rug, wringing his hands while Mrs. Blocksby, Agatha felt a delicious, entirely inappropriate thrill at the sight, actually had a hair out of place. The vicar's wife looked pale and deeply unsettled, her usual aura of serene rural perfection fractured. "Agatha," Mrs. Blocksby said, surprise registering through her distress. "And Charles, dear boy, have you found her?" "If I had found her, Margaret, I wouldn't be standing in your hallway without her," Agatha snapped, dispensing with village pleasantries. "Charles came to me now, show me the room." The vicar blinked, his round face flustered. "The room. But the police are likely plodding their way here, and we'll spend 2 hours taking notes on the floral wallpaper, Agatha interrupted, pushing past him toward the stairs. If Isabella left willingly, she left traces. If she didn't, well, time is of the essence, isn't it? Which way? Mrs. Bloxby, too frazzled to argue, and perhaps a little intimidated by Agatha's sheer metropolitan force, led them upstairs. The guest bedroom was suffused with the heavy, sweet scent of lilies, dominating the space. Hung against the wardrobe door like a ghostly apparition was the wedding dress. It was a cascade of ivory silk and vintage lace, waiting for a bride who was nowhere to be found. Agatha stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the space. The bed was unmade, sheets tossed aside casually. Isabella's phone, an expensive silver model, sat squarely on the nightstand next to a half-empty glass of water. "You said you spoke to her at 8?" Agatha asked, turning to Mrs. Bloxby. "Through the door." "Yes," the vicar's wife replied, dabbing her nose with a handkerchief. "I brought up a tray of tea and toast. She called out that she was just getting in the shower and would eat it later." Agatha peered at the tray resting on the dressing table. The toast was cold, dry, and untouched. The tea in the porcelain cup had formed a dark, stagnant film. "So you didn't actually see her?" "Well, no, but it was her voice. She sounded quite cheerful." "Cheerful," Charles said earlier, but quiet. Agatha corrected, filing the behavioral discrepancy away. Why would a bride be cheerful but refuse to open the door on her wedding morning? Just then, the bedroom door opened wider, and Miss Pendleton poked her narrow face into the room. How the woman had slipped past the vicar downstairs was anyone's guess. But Agatha suspected sheer nosy willpower. "I shouldn't be interrupting," Miss Pendleton gasped, her eyes gleaming with absolute, unconcealed delight. "But I felt I must speak up. I saw it." "Saw what?" Agatha demanded, irritated by the intrusion. "The car, a sleek, black, dreadful-looking thing, roaring down the lane behind the vicarage, just after 8:30. I said to myself, 'Sylvia, that is not a village vehicle. That is the car of a scoundrel.'" Agatha stared at her. Miss Pendleton was practically vibrating with the thrill of being at the center of the drama. She was also, Agatha was 90% sure, lying through her teeth. Miss Pendleton's cottage didn't even have a view of the back lane, and she was notorious in the village for sleeping until at least 10 o'clock on Sundays. "A black car, you say?" Agatha asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How fascinating, Sylvia. Did you happen to catch the make or the license plate? Or perhaps you were too busy looking through the solid brick wall of your kitchen to see the details." Miss Pendleton flushed a dull, angry red. "I know what I saw, Mrs. Raisin. Just because you're from London doesn't mean you know everything." She huffed indignantly and backed out of the room, her pride wounded. Agatha smirked, but her mind was racing. Why was the old bat lying? For attention, or was she covering for something, or someone else? She looked back at the untouched wedding dress. The village was already buzzing, spinning tales, and hiding behind polite concern. It was a tangled, messy web of social pretense, and Agatha Raisin was absolutely determined to tear it apart. Chapter 3. The blunt inquiries the local constabulary arrived with all the urgency of a Sunday stroll. Detective Sergeant Bill Wong, a young, polite officer who possessed the unfortunate curse of treating Agatha Raisin with a frustrating mix of professional deference and deep suspicion, pushed his way into the vicarage. "Right, what's all this then?" Bill asked, notebook already in hand, though he looked more exhausted by the prospect of village drama than a hardened investigator. He spotted Agatha hovering near the dressing table and sighed. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Raisin. Let me guess, you were just passing by to check the plumbing." "Don't be impertinent, Bill," Agatha snapped, crossing her arms. Her expensive silk blouse might have been ruined, but her posture remained formidable. "I am assisting. Charles is in a state of shock. The vicar is hyperventilating on a Persian rug, and your colleagues are currently 3 counties away, probably eating ploughmen's lunches. If you want to find Isabella before the Daily Mail gets wind of a Cotswold's runaway bride, you'll listen to me." Bill blinked, adjusting his glasses. "We don't even know she's run away, Mrs. Raisin. It could be a kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Agatha scoffed. "Please, who in Carsley has the organizational skills for a kidnapping? They can't even coordinate the parish council meetings without a spreadsheet and 3 rounds of passive-aggressive emails. No, Isabella staged her own exit, or she left with someone she knew. And you base this expert psychological assessment on what? Bill asked, raising an eyebrow. On the toast, Bill. The toast. Agatha gestured dramatically to the untouched plate. Mrs. Bloxby left tea and toast at 8. A woman planning to be kidnapped or murdered doesn't politely call out that she's jumping in the shower, but a woman planning to slip out the back door while everyone is distracted by wedding preparations. Absolutely accept. Agatha paused, her mind catching on the detail she'd noted earlier. Except she left her phone and her dress. No woman leaves a designer ivory silk dress behind unless she's running for her life in a terrible hurry or someone forced her out. Bill actually looked impressed for a fraction of a second before quickly masking it. Right. Well, we'll search the perimeter. I'll need everyone to stay put and— Rubbish, Agatha interrupted. Waiting around is for amateurs. I'm going to talk to people here, starting with the most annoying person in this parish. Before Bill could sputter a protest, Agatha spun on her heel and marched out of the vicarage. She had a target in mind, Colonel James. The colonel lived in a sprawling, slightly drafty manor down the lane, and he had been one of Isabella's loudest critics. Just last week at the village pub, the Red Lion, Agatha had overheard the colonel muttering into his pint about that flashy young minx ruining the property values with her fast cars and foreign ways. If anyone had a motive to scare Isabella off, or at least knew something about her mysterious background, it was him. Agatha strode down the lane, ignoring the curious stares of villagers lingering near the churchyard. She bypassed the front gate of the colonel's estate and marched straight up to the side patio, where the old man was aggressively pruning his rose bushes with heavy-duty shears. Snip. Snip. It sounded entirely too violent for gardening, Colonel. Agatha called out, pushing open the squeaky wooden gate. The colonel jumped, nearly lopping off a prize. Winning English rose. He turned, his face purple with indignation, his bristly white mustache twitching. Good God, woman, do you want to give a man a heart attack? What are you barging in here for? The wedding is next door. The wedding is cancelled, James, because the bride has vanished into thin air, Agatha said bluntly, stepping onto the patio and towering over him. The colonel's shears froze in midair. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his weathered features, instantly replaced by a guarded, defensive scowl. Vanished? Nonsense. Probably got cold feet. Women and their emotions, completely unreliable. Don't give me that old school bluster, Agatha said, stepping closer, her sharp eyes scanning his expression. Isabella was rich, beautiful, and completely unimpressed by your lectures on local traditions. You hated her. I didn't hate her, Mrs. Raisin. I simply felt she lacked propriety, the colonel sputtered, pointing a pruning shear dangerously close to Agatha's nose. She brought the wrong sort of crowd down from London. Loud cars, late-night visitors. Agatha's radar went off. Visitors? What sort of visitors, James? She pressed, leaning in, ignoring the threat of the shears. Men, women, business associates. The colonel clamped his mouth shut, realizing he had said too much. He turned back to his roses with sudden frantic interest. I'm a retired military man, madam. I don't keep tabs on the neighbors' comings and goings. Now kindly remove yourself from my property before I set the spaniel on you. That spaniel is toothless and terrified of squirrels, Agatha retorted, but she knew she had hit a nerve. Isabella had secret visitors, London connections, and someone in Carsley knew a lot more than they were letting on. As she turned to leave, a cold realization settled in her stomach. This wasn't just a quirky village gossip item. Someone in this peaceful, picturesque valley had a dark secret, and Isabella had stumbled right into it, or helped create it. Chapter 4. The obvious suspect, the village pub, the Red Lion, was normally a quiet sanctuary of damp wool, stale ale, and hushed gossip on a Sunday afternoon. Today, however, it was pulsing with a nervous, collective electricity. When Agatha pushed open the heavy oak door, the low hum of conversation instantly died down, replaced by a sudden, intense study of beer glasses and dartboards. Agatha scanned the room, sitting alone in the darkest corner booth, nursing a pint of bitter that he was staring at with intense, miserable concentration, was Gary Maplin. Gary was the village's resident oddity, a freelance computer programmer who lived in a cramped, cluttered cottage near the edge of the woods. Gary possessed all the social grace of a wet cat. He wore oversized sweaters in the middle of summer, rarely made eye contact, and most importantly, had spent the last 6 months publicly, pathetically infatuated with Isabella Vane. He had sent her poetry, bought her expensive gifts she invariably left behind, and lingered outside the old manor like a lovesick ghost. To the rest of Carsley, Gary was the obvious culprit. If a woman vanished, look for the weird, rejected man who couldn't take a hint. It was a neat, tidy narrative that the village could wrap its collective head around without straining its imagination. Agatha marched straight across the room, her sensible heels clicking sharply against the flagged floor. She slid into the booth opposite Gary without an invitation. Gary flinched, nearly spilling his beer. His pale, narrow face flushed a mottled pink, and he shrank back against the wooden paneling. "Mrs. Raisin, I'm not in the mood for company." "Too bad, Gary," Agatha said, fixing him with a hard, unblinking stare. "The entire village is currently deciding whether to string you up from the church steeple or hand you over to DS Bill Wong on a silver platter. You might want to give me a very good reason why I shouldn't help them." Gary swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. "I didn't do anything. Everyone always blames me because I keep to myself. It's not fair. Life isn't fair, Gary, especially when you make a public spectacle of yourself." Agatha retorted, though her mind was already processing his reaction. He was terrified, yes, but was he the terror of a guilty man, or just the panic of an innocent social outcast, cornered by a formidable woman? "I loved her," Gary whispered, staring miserably into his frothing pint. "Or I thought I did. She was different. She actually looked at me when she spoke. She didn't look right through me like the rest of them." "And when did you last see her, Gary?" Agatha asked, her voice softening just a fraction, enough to sound reasonable, but sharp enough to trap him. "Yesterday afternoon," he mumbled. "I went by the manor to drop off a book she said she wanted. A collection of poetry." He gave a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "She wasn't even there. Her housekeeper took it. But I saw someone else leaving." Agatha leaned forward, her interest spiking instantly. "Who?" "I don't know his name," Gary said, wringing his hands around his glass. "Some flash bastard, in a tailored suit. Not local. He got into a sleek black car, the kind with tinted windows, and tore down the lane like the devil was chasing him. Isabella wasn't answering her door to me, but she was meeting with him." Agatha's analytical mind clicked the pieces together. Miss Pendleton had lied about seeing a black car this morning, but Gary had actually seen one yesterday afternoon. A sleek, expensive car with a flash London type inside. This wasn't a random village abduction or a simple case of cold feet. Isabella had a past, and that past had just tracked her down to the Cotswolds. "Did she mention him to you? Did she ever talk about her life in London before she bought the manor?" Agatha pressed. Gary shook his head miserably. "She never talked about the past. She said she came here to start over. But people with money like that don't just start over, Mrs. Raisin. They run." Agatha sat back, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. The village was convinced Gary was the villain of the piece simply because he was awkward and wrote bad poetry. But as she looked at his shaking hands, she realized the solution was far too neat. The real danger hadn't come from the socially inept local boy. It had driven down from London in a tinted window car. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt. "Stay out of sight, Gary. If Bill Wong comes looking for you, tell him the truth, but leave out the poetry details. It does nothing for your dignity." Leaving Gary to his bitter beer, Agatha walked out of the Red Lion into the afternoon sun. The puzzle was expanding, and for the first time, Agatha felt a genuine shiver of unease. Isabella hadn't just disappeared. She had been hunted, and whoever was hunting her might still be lurking somewhere beneath the picturesque, polite surface of Carsley. Chapter 5. The Tea Party. If there was one thing capable of temporarily distracting the village of Carsley from a missing bride, it was cake. Or, more specifically, the parish council's emergency stabilisation meeting disguised as a genteel afternoon tea on the vicarage lawn. Mrs. Bloxby, demonstrating a resilience that Agatha both begrudgingly admired and secretly resented, had decided that cowering indoors would only encourage chaos. Tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the grass, laden with Victoria sponges, cucumber sandwiches, and an atmosphere thick with passive-aggressive speculation. Agatha navigated the lawn with the deliberate caution of a cat walking through a room full of rocking chairs. Her mind was still churning with Gary's revelation about the sleek black car and the mysterious man from London, but she couldn't investigate a shadowy metropolitan threat while dodging Mrs. Bloxby's terrifyingly polite cross-examination. "Agatha, dear," a melodic, drippingly sweet voice called out. Agatha winced inwardly. Mrs. Bloxby was bearing down on her, holding a delicate china teapot as if it were a tactical weapon. Beside her stood Colonel James, still bristling like an agitated hedgehog, and Mrs. Tamworth, the village gossip laureate, whose eyes gleamed with the malicious joy of a cat eyeing a bowl of cream. "Margaret," Agatha said, plastering on her best, most brittle London social smile. "Lovely spread, considering half the village is currently convinced aliens abducted the bride." "We are not discussing aliens, Agatha, though given the circumstances it would almost explain Charles's dreadful state," Mrs. Bloxby said smoothly, pouring a stream of amber tea into a floral cup. "We are simply trying to maintain a semblance of community calm. Sit down, do have a scone. You look as though you've been running marathons through briar patches." Agatha glanced down at her shoes. They were indeed scuffed, and her hair was staging a minor rebellion against its pins. She sat down stiffly, acutely aware that she was the centre of attention. Everyone on the lawn was pretending not to look at her, which meant every single eye was burning a hole in the back of her neck. "So Mrs. Raisin," Mrs. Tamworth purred, leaning forward over her cucumber sandwich with predatory enthusiasm. "Word has it, you've been hounding poor Gary Maplin down at the Red Lion. Is it true? Did he lock her in his dungeon? Does he have a dungeon? I've always wondered about that basement of his." Agatha took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Mrs. Tamworth squirm. "Gary Maplin couldn't organize a mugging in an empty alleyway, Cynthia, let alone a sophisticated abduction. If you want to look for a culprit, you should look at people with actual transport and a reason to hide." The Colonel choked on his tea, coughing violently into a checkered handkerchief. "And what is that supposed to mean, madam? Are you accusing me of running off with a young woman half my age?" "Only if she promised to teach you modern manners, James," Agatha retorted crisply. "Though I noticed you were awfully defensive earlier when I mentioned visitors." Before the Colonel could launch into an apoplectic tirade, Mrs. Bloxby intervened, her voice carrying that quiet, absolute authority that made even the most belligerent villagers fall in line. "That is quite enough, both of you. This is a church lawn, not a courtroom. The police are handling the matter." "Bill Wong is about as intimidating as a damp kitten," Agatha muttered, setting her teacup down with a sharp clink. "Be that as it may," Mrs. Bloxby said, her blue eyes fixing Agatha with a surprisingly sharp, knowing gaze. "Isabella was not entirely what she pretended to be, Agatha. Secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out, no matter how expensive the perfume you spray over them." Agatha froze. For a fraction of a second, she wondered if Mrs. Bloxby knew more than she was letting on. The vicar's wife was unassuming, but she missed very little. "What do you mean by that, Margaret?" Agatha asked, her PR instincts instantly sharpening. "Only that wealth in this village is often a shield," Mrs. Bloxby replied softly, refilling Agatha's cup without spilling a drop. "People come here to escape something, but what you run from usually catches up with you at the worst possible moment." Agatha stared at her. It was a remarkably profound statement for a Sunday afternoon tea party, and it sent a cold shiver straight down Agatha's spine. Isabella hadn't just vanished because of cold feet or a local stalker. Her past, whatever dark, tangled corporate or personal mess she had fled from in London, had finally caught up to her right here in the peaceful, polite Cotswolds. And Agatha knew, with a sudden, breathless certainty, that she was standing right in the middle of it. Chapter 6. Secrets Under Polite Smiles. The sun was beginning to dip below the rolling Cotswold hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns of Carsley. The village tea party had dissolved into nervous clumps of gossip, leaving Agatha with a headache and an overwhelming sense of irritation. She retreated to her cottage, kicking off her scuffed heels with a sharp sigh of relief. The house felt too quiet. Usually she didn't mind the solitude. It was a shield she wore against the world. But today, the silence felt heavy, charged with unanswered questions. She poured herself a generous glass of white wine, pacing her living room. Mrs. Bloxby's words echoed mockingly in her head. What you run from usually catches up with you at the worst possible moment. Isabella Vane had come to Carsley a year ago, wrapped in designer silk and mysterious wealth. She bought the old manor outright, paid in cash, and kept her past locked behind a polite, dazzling smile. But wealth in London didn't just appear out of thin air. It came from somewhere or someone, and luxury often masked a multitude of sins: embezzlement, fraudulent schemes, messy divorces, or dangerous partnerships. Agatha's PR brain began sorting through the possibilities. If Isabella was running from a scandal in the city, who stood to lose the most if she went public? Or more urgently, who stood to gain by keeping her quiet? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp rapping at her front door. Agatha groaned, downing the last of her wine. If it was Miss Pendleton with another invented sighting or DS Bill, Wong wanting to ask more pointless questions, she was going to scream. She yanked the door open, prepared for battle. It wasn't Bill or Sylvia, it was Charles Fraser. The young baronet looked even worse than he had that morning. His silk tie was gone, his collar was unbuttoned, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past Agatha into the hallway, collapsing onto the nearest chair with a heavy, ragged groan. "Charles, good Lord, pull yourself together," Agatha said, shutting the door behind him. She softened her tone only slightly, recognizing real distress when she saw it. "Do you want a drink?" "Scotch," he muttered into his hands. "If you have it." Agatha fetched a bottle and a tumbler, handing it to him. He practically inhaled half the contents before looking up at her, his expression a mix of anguish and terror. "She wasn't who she said she was, Agatha," Charles whispered. Agatha's instincts flared. She pulled up a chair opposite him, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" "Isabella," he said, his voice cracking. 3 weeks ago, I found a letter in her desk. I shouldn't have been looking, I know, but we were supposed to be getting married. There shouldn't have been secrets." He rubbed his face with trembling hands. It was a legal notice from a firm in London. They weren't addressing her as Isabella Vane. Agatha held her breath, not daring to interrupt. "Her name is Isabella Vance Smythe," Charles continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And she wasn't just wealthy. Her family's investment firm collapsed 2 years ago under massive fraudulent activity. Millions went missing. Her father took the fall and went to prison. But the authorities suspected someone else was running the books from the inside. Someone who vanished before the warrants could be issued." The pieces clicked together in Agatha's mind with terrifying clarity. It wasn't a runaway bride drama. It wasn't a local crime of passion. It was a high-stakes financial fallout. Isabella hadn't hidden in the Cotswolds to find peace. She had been hiding to save her skin. "And you confronted her about this?" Agatha asked quietly. Charles nodded miserably, staring down at his glass. "Last night. I told her we couldn't get married until she went to the police and cleared it up. She got furious. She said she didn't run away with the money, but that someone was blackmailing her. Someone who found out where she was hiding." Agatha's blood ran cold. The sleek black car Gary had seen yesterday afternoon. The mysterious visitor. Did she say who it was, Charles? Agatha pressed urgently, her heart hammering against her ribs. Charles shook his head slowly, tears pooling in his eyes. "No. She just said she was meeting someone this morning to pay them off, to make them go away for good." Agatha stood up abruptly, the wine glass forgotten on the table. The polite smiles of Carsley suddenly felt like a thin veneer over a very deep, very dangerous abyss. Isabella hadn't just disappeared. She had walked straight into a trap, and the person holding the strings was right here in the village. Chapter 7. The second incident. The morning sun cast a deceptively cheerful golden glow over Carsley, but Agatha woke with a knot of pure lead lodged in her stomach. Charles's confession had shattered the quiet illusion of the village. It wasn't a quaint backdrop for village feats and flower, arranging competitions anymore. It was a hunting ground. Agatha didn't wait for DS Bill Wong to bumble his way to any more obvious conclusions. She threw on a sharp tweed jacket, sensible trousers, and her sturdiest boots, marching out the door before the milk bottles had even warmed on the porches. Her destination was the edge of the parish where the dense, ancient woods met the boundary of the old manor's estate. If Isabella had planned to meet her blackmailer this morning, the secluded pathways behind the church and the old timber mill were the most logical spots. It was where dog walkers went to lose themselves, and where secrets could be buried without an audience. As she neared the timber mill, the crisp morning air carried a faint, acrid scent. Not wood smoke, something sharper, something wrong. Agatha quickened her pace, pushing aside a low-hanging branch of a beech tree. The clearing behind the mill came into view, and her breath caught sharply in her throat. Parked near the rotting wooden structure was a sleek, unmistakable vehicle, a black luxury sedan with heavily tinted windows, looking entirely out of place against the moss and mud of the Cotswolds. And standing near the open door of the vehicle was someone arguing. Agatha ducked behind a thick cluster of rhododendron bushes, her PR survival instincts kicking in. She strained her ears, holding her breath. "You should have handed it over in London," a sharp, clipped male voice snapped. It was smooth, expensive sounding, and dripping with venom. "Instead you dragged this out, and now the whole bloody county is looking at us." Agatha peered through the leaves. A tall, sharply dressed man in a charcoal designer suit stood by the car. His back was turned, but his posture radiated cold, calculating fury. A muffled, sobbing response came from inside the car, but the words were lost to the wind. "Don't play games with me, Isabella," the man sneered, leaning into the vehicle. "The rest of the documents, or this little countryside idyll of yours, ends today." Permanently, Agatha's heart hammered against her ribs. Isabella. She was alive, or at least she had been a moment ago. But she was trapped, cornered by a professional predator who clearly didn't care about village gossip or wedding dresses. Agatha's pride and her stubborn, impulsive streak flared up like a match in a dry room. She wasn't going to wait for Bill Wong. She wasn't going to let this slick city bastard bully a woman in her village, even if that woman was a fraudulent, lying runaway. Instead of creeping away to call the police, Agatha stepped out from behind the bushes, her heels crunching loudly on the dry twigs. "I'm terribly sorry," Agatha called out, her voice ringing sharp and clear across the clearing, dripping with artificial, haughty sweetness. "Is this parking space reserved, or are you just exceptionally rude?" The man spun around so fast he nearly tripped over his own Italian leather shoes. His face went slack with shock, revealing sharp, hard features and cold, calculating eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice dropping an octave into a menacing register. "Mrs. Raisin," Agatha said, marching forward with chin held high, though her hands were trembling slightly inside her pockets. "Resident, taxpayer, and someone who thinks your suit is entirely inappropriate for a muddy woodland trail. Now, step away from the car, or you'll find out just how painful a Cotswold's handbag can be." Inside the car, a pale, tear-stained face appeared at the tinted window. It was Isabella, looking nothing like the dazzling enchantress of Carsley, but rather a terrified fugitive at the end of her rope. The man's eyes flicked from Agatha to the car and back again. A dangerous, calculating smile touched the corners of his mouth. He realized he was caught on an open path, but he also realized Agatha was entirely alone. "You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong, Mrs. Raisin," the man said softly, taking a slow, menacing step toward her. And curiosity, as they say, is a fatal flaw. Agatha stood her ground, her jaw set, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She had wanted drama. She had wanted a mystery to solve. And now she had walked straight into the lion's den, completely unprepared for how sharp the teeth really were. Chapter 8. The confrontation in the clearing. The man in the charcoal suit stopped 3 feet from Agatha, his cold eyes scanning her with an appraising, dangerous glint. He looked like the kind of corporate shark who chewed up small businesses for breakfast and didn't lose a wink of sleep over it. Agatha forced her chin higher, refusing to shrink back. She might have felt a cold knot of dread twisting in her stomach. but years of handling hostile journalists and vicious London rivals had taught her one vital lesson. Never let them see you sweat. If you take another step forward, I'm going to start screaming at the top of my lungs, Agatha said, her voice dripping with sharp, icy disdain. And trust me, the local gamekeeper has a shotgun and zero sense of humor about strangers loitering in his woods. It was a bluff. The gamekeeper was currently 3 miles away at the local pub, but it hit its mark. The man's jaw tightened. He glanced quickly toward the dense tree line, weighing his options. Violence in broad daylight on a public footpath carried too many variables, especially with an inconveniently sharp-tongued woman standing in his path. Inside the car, the door clicked open. Isabella scrambled out, her designer clothes rumpled and her mascara smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. She stumbled, catching herself against the side of the vehicle, and rushed to hide half behind Agatha, clutching desperately at the sleeve of her tweed jacket. "Don't let him do anything, Agatha," Isabella gasped, her voice shaking violently. He'll kill me. He means it." The man let out a cold, humorless laugh, smoothing down his expensive lapels. "Don't be melodramatic, Isabella. I'm merely trying to collect what your father left behind. You thought you could hide out in this provincial backwater with a fake name and play at being a country lady. The digital trail doesn't disappear just because you swap city concrete for sheep manure." Agatha's eyes narrowed. So that was it, the missing millions from the Vance, Smythe corporate collapse. Isabella hadn't just run away from the scandal. She had taken the digital records, the hidden files that could either clear her father completely or implicate the real mastermind behind the fraud. And this man, whoever he was, had tracked her down to force her hand. "And you decided blackmail and intimidation were the best corporate strategies," Agatha retorted sharply, stepping slightly in front of Isabella to shield her. "In my day, we used lawyers and publicists, much cleaner, and vastly less likely to land you in a prison cell." The man's eyes flashed with genuine malice. He took a half step forward, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Mrs. Raisin. Step aside and let the girl handle her family business. This doesn't concern you." "Everything in Carsley concerns me," Agatha snapped back, refusing to budge an inch. "And you're trespassing on my parish." Before the man could respond, a sudden crashing sound echoed through the undergrowth behind them, accompanied by heavy, breathless panting and the enthusiastic barking of a spaniel. "Hello, is someone there? Hello." It was Colonel James, pushing his way through the rhododendrons with a walking stick in one hand and a bewildered expression on his face. "I thought I heard shouting. Good God, what's going on here? Is this a mugging?" The arrival of the colonel, backed by the distant, echoing sound of another voice shouting down the path, completely shifted the balance of power. DS Bill Wong must have finally dragged himself away from his tea and started investigating the perimeter. The man in the charcoal suit cursed under his breath, realizing his window of opportunity had slammed firmly shut. He shot one last venomous glare at Isabella, then at Agatha. "This isn't over," he hissed. He spun on his heel, slid into the driver's seat of the black sedan, and slammed the door. Seconds later, the engine roared to life, and the car fishtailed backward down the muddy track, kicking up a shower of dirt and gravel before disappearing toward the main road. Agatha let out a long, shaky breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt distinctly weak, but a fierce, triumphant thrill coursed through her veins. She had faced down the predator. She had protected the runaway bride. Colonel James blinked, lowering his walking stick as he took in the scene. Agatha standing tall and defiant, and Isabella weeping quietly against the fender of the car. "Well," the colonel sputtered, adjusting his tweed cap. "I say, was that the groom?" "No, James," Agatha said, straightening her jacket with a brisk, authoritative tug and pasting on a triumphant smile. "That was the real world, crashing right into your precious village. And it's about time someone taught it some manners." Chapter 9. Agatha's bold gamble. The dust from the black sedan had barely settled before DS Bill Wong came crashing through the tree line, looking flushed, out of breath, and holding a small notepad like a shield. "Right, what on earth is happening?" Bill demanded, his eyes darting from the colonel to Isabella and finally landing on Agatha. I received a report of a disturbance near the mill. Mrs. Raisin, tell me you weren't playing amateur detective again. Don't be absurd, Bill, Agatha said, brushing a speck of mud off her tweed jacket with an air of supreme nonchalance. I was merely taking a morning constitutional when I stumbled upon a rescue operation. You should be thanking me. If I hadn't interrupted, our missing bride might have been bundled into a boot and driven off to the Shires. Isabella clutched her arms, shivering despite the rising sun. He's going to come back, Bill. Julian won't stop until he gets the encrypted drive. Julian, Agatha, filed the name away instantly. So the slick corporate shark had a name, Julian. Bill blinked, pulling out his pen. Who is Julian? Look, we need to head back to the station. You both need to make formal statements. Statements can wait, Bill, Agatha interrupted, her mind racing with a sudden, brilliant, and gloriously reckless plan. She wasn't going to let some slick London crook slink away with the upper hand. Nor was she going to let the police bungle the case through months of tedious bureaucracy. She wanted this resolved now, publicly, and with maximum dramatic flair. She wanted Carsley to know she had cracked it. What do you mean? They can wait, Bill protested. A crime has been committed, extortion, harassment, and it's going to be solved by sundown, Agatha declared, cutting him off. She turned to Isabella, softening her tone just enough to be persuasive. Isabella, where is the drive? The one he's blackmailing you for? Isabella hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. It's in my desk at the old manor. I took it when the firm collapsed because I knew my father was taking the blame for someone else. I thought I could protect it, but Julian found out I had the digital backups that prove he was the one who drained the accounts. Agatha smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. Splendid. Then here is what we are going to do. 2 hours later, the Carsley Village Hall was packed to the gills. Under the guise of an emergency community resilience and parish welfare meeting, a gathering hastily organised by a very confused Reverend Bloxby, at Agatha's insistent, imperious demand, nearly every resident of note was crammed into the wooden pews. Mrs. Bloxby sat near the front looking profoundly sceptical. Colonel James was grumbling loudly about interruptions to his lunch schedule. Charles Fraser sat slumped in a chair, staring at the floor in stunned silence. At the front of the hall, standing beside a makeshift podium, was Agatha Raisin. She had gone home changed into an immaculate emerald green dress, fixed her hair, and applied a fresh coat of lipstick. She looked less like a village resident and more like a high-powered CEO about to hostily take over a corporation. The murmuring died down as Agatha tapped a gold-ringed fingernail sharply against the microphone. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Agatha began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "We are here today to discuss a missing bride. A series of very imaginative village lies about black cars, and a massive corporate fraud that has just bled into our peaceful little valley." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Mrs. Tamworth instantly leaned forward, her eyes practically sparkling with glee. "Now," Agatha continued, pacing slowly across the stage like a theatrical director, "most of you assumed Isabella Vane ran away because of cold feet, or because local oddities like poor Gary Maplin frightened her off. Both assumptions are entirely wrong. Isabella hid in Carsley because she was carrying something dangerous, proof that her family's company was destroyed not by her father, but by an ambitious, ruthless partner who wanted it all." She paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. "That man tracked her down this morning," Agatha said, her voice dropping into a register of sharp accusation. "He threatened her. He thought she was entirely alone and helpless, but he made one fatal mistake. The heavy oak doors at the back of the village hall creaked open. Every head in the room turned. Striding down the centre aisle, looking dangerously sleek and entirely out of place in his charcoal designer suit, was Julian. He had tracked Isabella here, following her scent like a predator closing in on a wounded animal, entirely unaware that he was walking straight into a trap meticulously engineered by Agatha Raisin. He thought, Agatha finished, locking her eyes onto the newcomer as he froze in the middle of the aisle, that he could come into our village and dictate terms. "Well, Julian, welcome to Carsley. Meet the audience." Chapter 10. The reveal and the resumption of normalcy. The silence in the Carsley Village Hall was so absolute you could have heard a daffodil drop. Every head whipped around toward the back aisle. Julian stood frozen midway down the pews, his impeccably tailored charcoal suit standing out like a drop of ink in a bowl of cream. For a fraction of a second, the polished corporate shark looked genuinely startled. Then his expression hardened into a mask of cold, dismissive contempt. "What is this ridiculous circus?" Julian sneered, his voice cutting cleanly through the quiet room. He took a deliberate step forward, ignoring the hostile glares of Colonel James and the bewildered stares of the villagers. "Isabella, hand over the drive, or I promise you, the police will be arresting your father on an entirely new wave of charges by morning." "There won't be any arrests of the innocent today, Julian." A calm, steady voice rang out from the side door. DS Bill Wong stepped into the hall, flanked by two uniformed officers. He wasn't looking exhausted anymore. He looked entirely professional, holding a small recording device in his hand. Julian's face finally lost its color. He spun around toward the exit, but the local constables had already blocked the aisle. Agatha stood at the podium, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She felt a warm glow of absolute vindication radiate from the top of her freshly styled hair down to the tips of her sensible green heels. "You see, Julian," Agatha called out, leaning into the microphone with theatrical satisfaction, "you made two critical errors. First, you assumed a small village wouldn't notice a sleek luxury car tearing down narrow country lanes. Second, and this was your truly fatal blunder, you assumed that when you threatened me in the woods this morning, I was just a frightened local busybody." She tapped the small digital recorder resting beside her notes. "While you were busy intimidating Isabella, my phone was tucked safely in my tweed pocket, recording every single word of your charming confession about draining the accounts and framing her father. DS Wong has had the audio feed streaming live to his cruiser for the last 10 minutes. A gasp of pure shock swept through the pews, instantly followed by an explosive burst of whispers. Mrs. Tamworth looked like she had just won the lottery. Julian lunged forward, a desperate feral look in his eyes. But DS Wong was already stepping forward, clicking handcuffs into place with practiced efficiency. "Julian Vance Smythe, you're arresting for extortion, blackmail, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. Anything you say—" "Oh, spare us the television speech, Bill," Agatha interrupted airily, waving a dismissive hand. "Just get him out of here. The smell of cheap arrogance is ruining the varnish on the pews." As the disgraced executive was hauled out of the hall, the room erupted into a cacophony of chatter. Isabella broke down in tears, but this time they were tears of profound relief, rushing forward to hug a slightly stiff, deeply uncomfortable Charles, who looked like a man who had narrowly survived a runaway steamroller and wasn't quite sure how to process it. Even Colonel James muttered something that sounded suspiciously like praise, though he quickly covered it up by coughing loudly into his handkerchief. By evening, Carsley had returned to its aggressively peaceful rhythm. The drama of the runaway bride, the corporate conspiracy, and the village hall showdown became the sole topic of conversation at the Red Lion for precisely 3 nights, which, in Cotswold's terms, was an eternity. Agatha sat in her living room, nursing a well-earned glass of expensive white wine. The cottage was quiet. The hydrangeas she had abandoned on her table had long since wilted, looking sad and neglected in their green slime. She walked over, picked up the disastrous floral arrangement, and dropped it straight into the kitchen bin. She didn't win the best-in-class ribbon at the flower show. Mrs. Bloxby's serene, effortless arrangement took first place, naturally. But as Agatha poured herself a second glass of wine and looked out her window at the darkening, picturesque lane, she didn't care. She had faced down a corporate predator, solved a mystery that the local police were ready to bungle, and proved once and for all that underestimating Agatha Raisin was a very, very dangerous game. She took a sip of wine, a small, proud smile touching her lips, before muttering to the empty room, "Right, now, what on earth am I going to wear to the parish council meeting tomorrow?" Chapter 11. The aftermath and the potted begonia piece in Carsley had a distinct texture. It sounded like the dull thrum of lawnmowers on a Monday morning, smelled faintly of damp wool and cut grass, and tasted like the lingering regret of having eaten one too many scones at the vicarage. For Agatha Raisin, however, peace was always a temporary condition, a brief lull between storms that she invariably found herself attempting to spice up out of sheer, unadulterated boredom. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours after the dramatic village hall showdown that had sent Julian packing in a pair of shiny silver bracelets. The national tabloids had managed to squeeze a modest, slightly inaccurate paragraph about Cotswold's PR queen and runaway bride foil corporate plot on page 14 of the Daily Mail, accompanied by an archival photo of Agatha, looking somewhat severe. She had cut the clipping out, laminated it, and placed it neatly in the bottom drawer of her desk, right beneath her spare keys. She stood before her kitchen mirror, critically inspecting her hair. A few rebellious silver strands were staging a breakout near her temples. Time for a touch-up, she thought with a small sigh, pressing a hand to her cheek. She was 50-something, fiercely independent, and occasionally prone to devastating bouts of loneliness that she masked with expensive face creams and aggressive interior decorating. A sharp, familiar knock at her front door broke her reverie. Agatha groaned softly. If it was Charles wanting to talk about wedding rescheduled dates, or Mrs. Bloxby dropping by with a humble brag peace offering of first-place competition leftovers, she was going to pretend she had emigrated to Australia. She yanked the door open, her sharp retort already loaded. It was neither Charles nor the vicar's wife. Standing on her porch, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a slightly rumpled tweed jacket that smelled faintly of stale beer and ink, was Gary Maplin. Agatha stared at him. The village outcast was holding something awkward against his chest, wrapped in brown butcher's paper and tied with an untidy piece of twine. "Gary," Agatha said, her tone a mix of suspicion and surprise, "if you've come to recite another bad poem about my investigative prowess, I'm locking the door." Gary flushed a deep, luminous crimson, his eyes darting frantically toward the gravel path, as if looking for an escape route. No, Mrs. Raisin, I just wanted to drop something off." He thrust the brown paper, wrapped bundle forward as though it might detonate. "To say thank you." Agatha raised an eyebrow, taking the parcel. It was surprisingly heavy. She peeled back the rough paper to reveal a sturdy terracotta pot containing a remarkably healthy, bright pink begonia. "A plant?" Agatha asked, genuinely baffled. "You brought me a potted plant, Gary." "It's a specific variety," Gary mumbled, staring resolutely at his scuffed trainers. "Called the London Pride. I read about it, thought, well, everyone else in the village has been treating you like some kind of terrifying witch since Sunday, whispering behind your back at the post office. But you cleared my name, everyone knows. I didn't have anything to do with the disappearance now." He shifted uncomfortably. "So, yeah. Thanks." Agatha looked down at the bright pink petals. For a fleeting second, a warm, unfamiliar tightness gripped her chest. Carsley could be a suffocating, judgmental snake pit of gossip and class snobbery, but underneath the polite smiles and backhanded compliments, there was an underlying current of genuine humanity. Even from the village pariah, a rare, softened smile touched Agatha's lips. She felt a sudden, unexpected swell of pride, not just for unmasking a corporate criminal, but for actually making a tiny, dented space for herself in this stubborn little valley. "Well," Agatha said briskly, clearing her throat to mask the sudden emotion threatening to crack her voice, "it's about time someone around here appreciated my PR talents. Gary, come inside. I won't offer you beer at 10 inches the morning, but I can manage a very decent cup of instant coffee and a stale biscuit if you're brave enough." Gary's face lit up with a hesitant, unbelieving smile. "Really? You mean it? Don't look so shocked, man. Move before I change my mind," she commanded, stepping aside to let him into the hallway. As Gary awkwardly shuffled past her, carrying the begonia like a fragile artifact, Agatha closed the front door behind them. The house felt warm. The hydrangeas were gone, replaced by a humble, pink flowering weed from the edge of the woods. She walked back into her kitchen, a fresh bounce in her sensible heels. The mystery was solved. The village had returned to its gossip, and her pride was intact. She was Agatha Raisin, survivor of London boardrooms and Cotswolds, murder plots alike. And as she reached for the kettle, she decided that life in Carsley wasn't quite as dull as she liked to pretend. Chapter 12. The village fete and a new beginning. The summer sun beat down on the Carsley village green with a cheerful, unapologetic intensity that seemed entirely designed to mock anyone attempting to wear structured clothing. It was the annual Carsley summer fete, an institution of mild peril involving runaway wheelbarrows, dangerously unstable sponge cakes, and the ferocious, hyper-competitive spirit of people who had nothing better to do on a Saturday afternoon. Agatha Raisin stood beside the coconut shy, shielding her eyes with oversized designer sunglasses and wearing a crisp white linen dress that screamed expensive urban resistance to the rustic surroundings. She held a cluster of wooden balls, eyeing the fuzzy brown targets with the cold, unblinking focus of a sniper. Thump. Her first ball hit the wooden peg with a dull clatter, missing every single coconut by a generous margin. Beside her, Mrs. Bloxby offered a serene, devastatingly polite smile. A bit high, Agatha. Perhaps a gentler wrist. Agatha shot the vicar's wife a look that could have curdled cream. I am entirely warmed up, Margaret. The wind off the cricket pitch is behaving with absolute malice today. She wound up again, threw with ferocious intent, and successfully dislodged a solitary coconut, which tumbled into the sawdust with a dull thud. A polite, half-hearted round of applause rose from the small knot of villagers gathered nearby. Life in Carsley had snapped back to its normal, aggravating rhythm with terrifying speed. The drama of the runaway bride, the corporate conspiracy, and Julian's dramatic arrest had already slipped from front-page gossip to comfortable village folklore. Isabella Vance, Smythe, now quietly cleared of any wrongdoing thanks to the encrypted drive, and DS Bill Wong's official report, had left the old manor, heading back to London to help rebuild her family's name, leaving Charles Fraser single once more and nursing his wounded pride with an impressive amount of village cider. Yet, something fundamental had shifted. As Agatha strolled away from the coconut shy, smoothing down her linen skirt, she noticed the way people looked at her. The whispers behind the post office counter weren't quite as hostile anymore. The net curtains twitched with a new flavor of respect, a grudging acknowledgement that beneath the sharp tongue, expensive perfume, and London airs, Mrs. Raisin was someone you simply did not want to cross. Looking for a challenge. Mrs. Raisin. Agatha turned to see DS Bill Wong weaving his way through the crowd of damp children and exhausted Morris dancers, holding a paper plate laden with a suspiciously dense-looking slice of fruitcake. If that cake is from Mrs. Tamworth's baking station, Bill, I'd suggest using it as a doorstop rather than consuming it. Agatha retorted, crossing her arms. What do you want? Has another criminal driven into a sheep pen? Bill chuckled, adjusting his glasses. Nothing quite that exciting. I just wanted to let you know the paperwork on the Vance Smythe case is officially closed. Julian is awaiting trial in London, and your statement was, well, surprisingly compliant with protocol. Compliant? Agatha arched an eyebrow. I practically handed you the case wrapped in a pink bow. Bill, true, Bill conceded with a grin. Which is why the inspector wants to know if you're available to consult on a minor property dispute involving a boundary hedge on Church Lane. Agatha's eyes narrowed with sharp, instant amusement. A boundary hedge. It was insultingly small scale. It was precisely the kind of tedious, petty village nonsense she used to mock. But as she looked out over the sun-drenched green, at Colonel James arguing with the butcher over a raffle ticket, Mrs. Bloxby smiling serenely near the tea tent, and the bright pink London Pride begonia sitting safely on her kitchen windowsill back home, a warm, unexpected contentment settled over her. Tell the inspector, Agatha said, her lips curving into a slow, wicked smile, that my consulting fees are strictly cash, and he'll need to bring me a very large gin and tonic if he wants my professional opinion on a bunch of shrubbery. Bill laughed, shaking his head. I'll let him know. See you at the committee meeting, Agatha. As the young detective walked away, Agatha turned back toward the festivities. The band struck up a lively, slightly out of tune rendition of a traditional country march. She adjusted her sunglasses, took a deep breath of the dust and sunflower-scented air, and marched straight toward the tea tent. She might not have won the flower-arranging prize, and she might still occasionally wonder why she had ever left London. But as she surveyed her domain, Agatha Raisin knew one thing for certain: Carsley would never be dull again, as long as she was around to stir the pot.